Welcome to When Did You Know? I'm Ariel, and this week I'm joined by Heather Paterson. Heather is a queer woman who's worked in LGBT plus and broader equality campaigns and projects for over 20 years and is currently the Chief Executive of Sheffield LGBT plus youth charity Say It. Say It is an incredible LGBT plus young people and sexual health and HIV charity based in Sheffield, UK, which was established in 1999. And their vision is to create an environment that supports the sexual and emotional well-being of young people and empowers LGBT plus young people and those affected by HIV to transform their own lives. So thank you for joining me, Heather, and welcome.
Thank you. It was lovely to be invited. Thank you very much.
So each episode starts with the same three questions. And to begin with, how do you identify?
So I identify as a queer woman. I've used different labels over the years. When I was younger, I came out as bi and then gay. And I was like, you know what? Like, I'm somewhere in that bubble and I don't really need to sort of identify where I'm sticking my pin in on that spectrum, and I just prefer the term queer. For me, I know some people have quite strong feelings either for or against the term, but for me it means that personally I don't have to give you that level of detail, and then it also feels more connected to a wider community of, like, you know, of a broader spectrum of queer people rather than this one little section of the community. So yeah.
That's a really nice way of putting it, actually. I did an interview this morning, actually, and we were talking about the word queer. And for me, it's something that I don't mind when other people use it. For some reason, it coming out of my mouth, I'm still trying to get used to it. But that's a really nice way of putting it, actually. It's just, rather than putting yourself into one part of the community, it's just a broader. Yeah, I like that. So the second question, when did you come out?
It's always a weird one, isn't it? I think the question's always, when did you come out for the first time? Because
absolutely,
it's not a one-time thing. It's something that you have to do, or end up doing repeatedly throughout your life. But my first sort of big first coming out, I was 18. So, which I suppose is still relatively young, but I knew I was queer when I was 7 years old. And it took another 11 years for those words to come out of my mouth and for me to tell anyone. And part of that was I was still living at home, I was still at school, college. Everyone around me were people I'd known pretty much since I was born or I was a toddler. And the thought of if any of those people had reacted negatively, and I still had to see them every day, and I just didn't do it. So when I was 18, I moved to university, and I pretty much decided maybe 3-4 years in advance that was when I was coming out, and that everyone, when I moved to a new city to university, was going to meet me as a queer woman. And then if they had an issue with it, I'd just met them, so I wouldn't be bothered. So I kind of turned up to Sheffield on day one of like, ta-da, I'm here, I'm queer, this is me, and sort of like was that quite probably in your face about it, because I was just sort of like, if you have an issue, I want you to back away now, and then, me not form any form of relationship or friendship with you for that then to be a problem. So that was my first sort of coming out. But like I said, it's something that we do all the time. It shocks me sometimes that I assume that I live in this sort of little queer bubble because I work full time in the LGBT sector. I've campaigned for so many years. Most of my friends are LGBT queer, and I literally get to the point sometimes in life where I almost forget straight people exist, and then I'll just be in a shop or at the hairdressers or chatting to someone at the bus stop or something, and someone will be like, "Oh, what's your boyfriend or husband doing?" I'm like, "What?" And it just completely throws me to go like, why would you even think that?
Absolutely. I think, but actually, even saying that as a gay man, I think I'm sometimes a bit heteronormative in my thinking, because it's kind of drilled into you that I work in equality and diversity, but I'm not surrounded by LGBT plus people all the time. And so I think I sometimes make presumptions that everyone is heterosexual, which is awful to say as an LGBT plus person, but that's, yeah. I mean, and I'll go on to the last question because you kind of alluded to it there. So when did you know?
I think I pretty much always, I mean, I think I was aware of it at around about 7, I'd say, sort of going into junior school age. And I think it was more for me a realization that other people weren't clear. So there was just sort of like, it was like, well, this has always been a part of me. And at that age, it wasn't a sexual thing, but you knew that, that you had those sort of closer friendships with girls that, when we were watching Jason and Kylie or whatever it was at that age, I'm sort of giving my age away now, but, I assumed that all of the other girls were having the same thoughts about Kylie that I was. And it was around that sort of primary school, junior school age of realising, oh, well, maybe they're not having those same thoughts. Like the other girls want to have boyfriends and I'd like to have a girlfriend, and those sort of realisations. So it was, I think at that age, it was more a realisation of other people. I already knew myself, but it was going, oh, hang on, what I know about myself, I'm now making that comparison between me and other people and seeing that I'm different and that other people aren't thinking that way or seeing those same things. So I think that was, and I didn't necessarily use that language at that time. And like I say, at that age, it wouldn't have been a sexual thing, but it was that, probably around the 7 years old that I was sort of very aware that I was different to the other girls in my class.
And when you started to realize, I mean, when did you kind of see yourself represented, I guess, in a way? Because that's quite a young age to start to realize that you're different, but you kind of can't quite put a label on it yet, whether that's necessary or not. But when did you kind of see yourself or see, oh, this is what it is?
I think the sad thing is that for a long time, I didn't at all. I mean, I went to school when it was still Section 28. It wasn't something that was spoken about. To see LGBT people in general, I still remember the only mention in sort of mainstream media of LGBT people was around the AIDS crisis. And to this day, I don't know if you remember the advert with the tombstone where they were like chiseling AIDS into this tombstone and like it being a death sentence. And it was like, either you didn't exist or you were going to get AIDS and you were going to die. And that was only men. So like the women didn't exist, and so there was very little representation. I think for me, I always looked to sort of strong female role models who, I didn't necessarily know their sexuality. I didn't necessarily need to know their sexuality, but for women who were sort of very confident and outspoken. So I listened to a lot of female fronted bands. I was really into sort of Hole and Garbage and people like that. And so I was like into sort of shouty women with attitude. And that appealed to me in terms of, so they were the people who I looked up to in the absence of, and some of those will have been LGBT people. But yeah, that there was something about that defiance against sort of gender roles, of seeing women who were in male dominated arenas and absolutely bossed it. And that, they were the people who I'd sort of look up to as role models. But yeah, seeing out gay women, they, there were a few, but, and they were generally older, so as a 15 year old, I wasn't particularly looking up to Sandy Topsvig because, as brilliant as she is, she's the same generation as my mum, so, and as a teenager, no one who's your mum's generation is in any way cool, so yeah, it's got a lot much better now, but I still don't think that we're there. I said, we still need more and broader representation. I'm a white British woman and I didn't see anyone who looked like me. If I was a black trans kid, I definitely wouldn't have been seeing anyone like me, so that's if I wasn't seeing representation, think of other members of the community who are far more marginalised definitely weren't seeing that.
And thinking back to when the AIDS advert was out and when Section 28 was in place, I mean, what were what were conversations like at home? Were there any conversations around, I'm just thinking particularly, I think back a lot with my family. So I grew up, I'm a few years younger than you, but not many. So I grew up towards the tail end of Section 28, but it was still very much there whilst I was at school. But I often think about my family seemed to have learned to accept very slowly, in some people's cases, LGBT issues in how things were represented in television, particularly soap operas. So when Emmerdale had a gay kiss, that was, and I can remember sitting there and hearing quite homophobic conversations in my family around it. So how was that when those real visceral adverts, particularly related to AIDS, as it was called, what were conversations like around your family? Did that push you back in the closet a little bit? How was that?
Yeah, I mean, it generally, it wasn't something that was spoken about a lot at all. I've got to say there was definitely a difference between my parents in terms of my father worked at the university, had a much broader sort of friendship group, so, and work colleagues and students, and was pretty open-minded in most respects. I think being in that context, my mum grew up in sort of quite sheltered, so was quite ignorant in the nicest way. She would never be intentionally horrible to someone or mean to cause offence, but she's very much someone who, even to this day now, I pick her up on sort of quite a bit of language and say, you really can't say that, and she doesn't mean anything by it. So there've been quite a lot of those sort of difficult conversations coming out of saying things that just, weren't really appropriate, even in the 80s. But you were surrounded by that, so I don't think I necessarily felt, oh, this is an awful home to live in and the but it was just it just wasn't something that you spoke about at all. And I think that one of the funniest ones for me is because I didn't come out directly to my parents. I came out accidentally. So once I'd moved to university, and there's a brilliant conversation that I only know of because it was relayed to me by my kid sister who still lived at home at the time. But I'd moved to university. I'd come out to everyone pretty much with the exception of my parents. And I thought maybe need to wait till I go back home at Christmas or something. So I hadn't come out to my parents yet. But I was LGB officer at Hallam Uni. So whenever I sent an email, that was my signature on the bottom of my emails, head pastor LGB officer. And when I emailed home doing my, this is what I've been doing at uni and whatever my little sort of parent-friendly update was, I'd just delete my signature off. And one time I forgot. And my sister phoned me up straight away to absolutely roaring with laughter because they got the email through. My dad sat there at the computer. My mum's hovering over his shoulder because she can't get too close to the technology. And reading the email at the bottom, Heather Pastor, LGB officer. And my mum's like, what's LGB stand for? What's that mean? And my dad's like, lesbian, gay, bisexual. Like, that doesn't mean our Heather. She's not, is she? And my dad's like, well, yeah, isn't it bloody obvious? So I hadn't come out to him, but he knew. So my mum's like, well, no, it's not obvious, why? And at the age of sort of 17, 18, I had a skinhead, Doc Martens, the dungarees, I was, obviously someone's presentation does not in any way indicate their sexuality, but at 17, I couldn't have been more of a walking sort of stereotypical lesbian, because I think that was part of my sort of ta-da, I'm here, that I thought I had to adopt the dress code. So my dad's like, surely it's obvious. And I was like, no. It's like, well, what about the posters in her wall when, like, in her bedroom when she's done like, because she had all these like sort of Courtney Love and Shirley Manson and people up. And my mum was like, yeah, I thought she just liked the music. And my dad turned around and said she liked Metallica, but there were no pictures of them in their undercrackers, were there? And I was just like, I wish I could have actually been a fly on the wall for that conversation. But my sister picked the phone up straight away, just crying with laughter to relay the conversation to me. So, and they were fine,
I think you mentioned then as well about and obviously how people present is not really necessarily linked to their identity, but you mentioned then about kind of in a way, you kind of, when you came out, you kind of attacked it, I guess, and you went all in. And did you feel like you had to, and it might go back to that lack of role models, because there wasn't a diversity in the role models that there were, if there were any. Did you feel you had to perform or be in a certain way when you first come out and you're trying to find who you are? And
yeah, I think it was that sort of thing that I wanted. I'd waited so long to come out in my mind that I wanted everyone to know that, like, as soon as they, looked at me from about 2 miles away, I just needed to sort of like scream queer at them, and that was, like I say, there wasn't any diversity representation. So for me, 17, 18 years old, that was what a lesbian looked like. That was what a queer woman looked like. And so, yeah, I mean, I've got really don't suit a skinhead, but number 2 all over, off it came. It was and to be fair, I've had several other fashion disasters over the years, but that was very much the sort of school of thought at that point, was like, adopting the uniform, so to speak. And then, it's taken time from then to actually go, well, this is who I am, and this is how I'm comfortable, and this is how, still wear the docks and dungarees from time to time, but I don't feel the need that I have to perform or present in a certain way to meet someone's expectations. I'm sat here today in a floral dress because it's summer, and that's how it's summer. I put a summer dress on and I feel quite comfortable in that. I don't feel the need. Maybe with the temperatures today, the shaving of the head doesn't sound like a bad idea, just for practical purposes.
I think that's true. I mean, there is, and I when I came out, I sort of did the whole, in a similar way of like, I'm queer, I'm here, and everything was, and I was being very performative, I think, and I am camp, and I'm fine with that. But I think it was very performative initially when I first came out, because it became this, I must behave like this, because, and my main point, it was around the time that Will and Grace had just started, and I basically modeled myself on Jack. And that wasn't really me, but it's taken years to find a way of being comfortable. And I guess, most teenagers go through that anyway, but it was interesting times. What I did want to ask was, is there, so thinking about to say it and actually and where you work, so what does say it provide that now that you wish was in place during your teenage years? I know that's quite broad, but is there a couple of particular services, I guess, that you wish?
Well, I did actually. So I attended what was at the time the LGBT Youth Initiative, which was the 18 to 25 group at the time. So when I came to Sheffield, I did eventually discover the LGBT youth group, and I was still young enough to be in the oldest group. And at the time, that was a separate organisation, but that's now under us and part of what we offer. So I did manage to sneak in the back end, but I would have loved for there to have been an LGBT youth group when I was younger. Sadly, I discovered many years later that there was, but because I'm of an age bracket where there wasn't the internet, I never found out about it. So there actually was a youth group in Liverpool when I was growing up, and I just didn't know it was there. So someone had to know, someone had to tell you about it. You had to pick up a flyer from the right place, and I just never did. So it was something that I subsequently found out in my 20s doing some LGBT history research of, oh damn, there was a group I could have been sneaking off to. So I think that's a lot better now, just having a space where there's some people who are like you, or at least not going to question that, that you being LGBT, or question that is in some way unusual or different, and just feel a space where you can feel safe and comfortable. I went to a secondary school. I actually went to an all-girls school, and there were 1,400 young people in that school. And to my knowledge, throughout the 7 years that I was there, because I did the sixth form as well, there was one girl in the year below me who had mentioned that she was bi-curious, and the entire school knew about it. Now, clearly, lots of LGBT students in that school who have subsequently come out, but at that time, that's the difference between going to school in that area, that it just wasn't something I mentioned to people now that I went to an all-girls school, and they're like, "Oh, you must have done well all the time." It's like, and I was like, no. But looking back now, I've looked on my old school's website, because actually it was one of the possible schools that my niece might have ended up going to. So I was having a little look as to what it looks like now, sort of a few decades later. And they've got an LGBT group, and they celebrate Pride. And amongst the sort of photos on their social media pages, there's clear pictures of couples holding hands and stuff. And it's a complete world of difference. So I think just the provision to have that space, and for some young people where school, while it's much better, school or college may still not be that safe space for them where they're comfortable being out, and that they might not want the whole school to know, especially if it's something that they're still figuring out themselves. So having a space where they can come and be comfortable to do that figuring out, I think is really, really important. I think the other thing that we do that's really, really important, obviously we run the youth groups, but we also have, that you may have seen on the website, our Noah Lomax Fund. And Noah was a young gay man who at 15 took his own life, and he was known to be struggling with his mental health. He was on the waiting list for CAMS, the Youth Mental Health Service. So it was something that people were aware of, and he was awaiting therapy, and he never got to the front of that list. So obviously his parents, his family didn't want any other young person to ever be in that situation. And so they set up the Noah Lomax Fund for us. So that pays for private counselling at the point of need. So if we have a young person now, they may still go onto the waiting list for CAMS, but we can say, oh, well, actually, you can see one of our counsellors on Tuesday. So actually there's someone you can speak to pretty much straight away. We can usually get you in to see someone within the week. And the difference that has made to our young people, and having that provision, I think, is really, really important. The rate of, mental health difficulties amongst LGBT people across the board, actually, but specifically, obviously our focus is on LGBT young people. The mental health absolute crisis, to be honest, of, the level of need, and to be able to offer that support, I think is just really, really valuable. So
I was going to ask actually, and how services have adapted. So working in your field for 20 years, how services have adapted in that time, and you kind of answered it. And I think there's something about, I think services now are probably more aware, and everyone's talking about mental health a lot more than they ever have, but ultimately there's not necessarily been an increase in availability of mental health support. So people, I guess, are aware of the issues, but there's still not an increase in actually availability of appointments. And how have attitudes changed that you've seen in services towards LGBT plus young people?
I think it's something now that so many organisations are aware of, but they don't. I think there's a lot of nervousness still on a professional side, of nervousness around, specifically a lot around language, but whether they're knowledgeable enough, that it's seen. We're obviously a specialist LGBT service, but for other youth services or generic sort of voluntary sector charitable services that are dealing with all people, LGBT is seen as a specialism, and quite often it's viewed as a specialism and viewed as something that professionals don't always feel confident in. And so instead of thinking, well, I'll just support this person in the same way that I would support anyone else, it's like, oh, well, hang on, I might use an incorrect term, I might cause offence, I might be faced with something that I don't know about, and there's a lack. So that's something we come across quite a bit, that there's a sort of lack of professional confidence from people who have, they are trained professionals and absolutely know what they're doing and can support someone, but it's reassuring them that that's the case. And in some settings, actually, there is a need to have that specialist knowledge. If you are running a service that includes a sexual health provision, then you absolutely need to have the appropriate knowledge to provide a sexual health service to all people, and includes LGBT people within that. We do, at the moment, we have a project called Call It Out, which is an LGBT domestic abuse project. And that is, it's a little bit different to the other work that we do because it's not a delivery project. That is working with other service providers to improve the provision for LGBT people. So we work with the mainstream domestic and sexual abuse providers and housing providers who sort of look after the refugees and emergency accommodation, to look at how they can better improve their service and be more accessible to LGBT people. So we run training, we've got a kite mark scheme, we do general sorts of consulting work, we've got a network that we've set up of the South Yorkshire LGBT Domestic Abuse Network, because quite often there'll be one person within an organisation that they are the person that has the responsibility for LGBT, and they may be working in a bigger organisation but feel quite isolated. So we've set up a network for all those people who have that LGBT responsibility so that they can all come together and sort of share information and resources and go, well, you know, this is an issue that we're facing within our organisation. Have you come across that? How are you dealing with it? So that's a really valuable piece of work as well, because the stats around LGBT domestic abuse are quite frightening, and the numbers of people who are actually accessing support, we're not. So we know that LGBT people are experiencing higher rates of domestic abuse, but as a proportion, they're less likely to be walking through a door of a support service. So they're dealing with that on their own. And obviously that's something that we want to address. So that's what that project's working to do. But it definitely gives you an insight into some, you know, how LGBT is viewed in other sectors and other areas and other organisations. We've got so much to consider. You know, and we try to do that as well. That we're an LGBT organisation, but we try to take an intersectional approach, going that actually being LGBT is one part of your identity. But actually, what if you are LGBT and disabled, or LGBT and black, or LGBT and anything else? How does that interact, and how does that change experiences, and how does that, you know, impact what support you may need? So we did over the past year or so, we've also ran a project called See the Spectrums that was looking specifically at the intersections between young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And we looked at how we can set up our service to be more accessible. We have so some of the stuff we did that we trialled within our own service, and so we set up a steering group with young people with additional needs, and and got them to be what would make this space more comfortable for you. And we've done that within our own service. And we've run a national conference of sharing the learning from that project and going, you know, this is what we've learned by doing it. These are things that we've been able to put in place that you can put in place in your services to share that knowledge. So we have when all the groups that we run, we have a quiet room. So we have young people who have maybe sensory needs or get overwhelmed easily. So we always make sure there's a quiet space. We have some sort of sensory and fidget toys knocking about, some headphones, different things to make people more comfortable. And then we've looked at other disabilities as well. So we've got a number of young people who are hard of hearing, and all of our youth workers have done BSL training, so that at least we can obviously if for someone who's completely deaf, we will get translators in, but it means that our youth workers all at least know basic BSL, and are a lot more just consciously aware of young people who may need to rely more on lip reading, of things that we need to put in place, especially at the moment. Everyone's wearing masks, so being, you know, actually how does that impact? So just having those considerations.
There's a lot there as well. I mean, I might have said in a previous episode before, but for a long time growing up, because, you know, LGBT people, I mean, there's very little sex and relationships education now. There was nothing when growing up. And for a long time, I think till I was about 20, 21, I thought gay men just got HIV. No one ever explained to me how it actually happened.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that I could be safe. And I just thought it somehow magically happened to all gay men. But that's how poor sex and relationships education was. So to have stuff like that in place, it might not be in schools, which is a whole other battle.
Well, that is so that's actually something else that we've been working on over the past couple of years. So the new SRE curriculum actually did kick in September last year. So prior to September, so from when Section 28 ended in 2003-4, should know that off the top of my head, around that time. From that point, schools were allowed to teach about LGBT, but they didn't have to. So they could equally choose not to, which means that it's been a real sort of postcode lottery and sketchy provision because, and some schools are brilliant and would really like to, but they're pulled all over the place and there's loads of things that they would like to do, but they just haven't been able to resource or find the time for. So it's not saying that necessarily these schools are terrible. But then in some areas, we've had schools that have been brilliant for years and have had LGBT groups within the schools, that they've been running pride events, that they've always included gender sexuality stuff within their SRE curriculums. They've been teaching about sort of consent and looking at relationships in a much more sort of holistic way. But it just means that it's really been quite a broad range of what your experience could be in terms of schools. So as of September, the new curriculums come in, and it's not just LGBT SRE, it includes all sorts of stuff around. It's been updated around sort of drugs and alcohol, around a lot of more content around race and around different topics, but obviously LGBT within that. And so we've been working as part of the network in Sheffield that have been looking at the rollouts of the curriculum and creating content for that within South Yorkshire. So that is something that's going to change sort of going forward from around now, that schools are starting to do this if they weren't before, and it being more consistent, that you're not going to have a different level of LGBT education because you go to the school down the street from your mates who get something completely different. So there'll be a level of sort of base knowledge that everyone will have. So that should start hopefully to make a difference as that starts to filter through. And obviously that's not going to change things overnight. We've got people who have gone through, decades where there hasn't been any education. But as we go through that, in 10 years time, in 20 years time, people that have always known that, there are people some people like boys, some people like girls, some people identify one way or another, that, there's no right or wrong way to be or to love, and that's all okay. As that sort of filters through, I think that it will make the country, the world, a very different place. And, because it's difficult at the moment, I think, for all of the years of equality work that I've done in campaigning, for most of them, it sort of felt like, we're getting better. Okay, right, we've got equal age of consent now. We've got rid of Section 28. We've got same-sex marriage. We've got this. It's all going forward. And then the past few years have been, they're trying to, they're kicking off about the Gender Recognition Act. There's, all these sort of anti-LGBT groups popping up. You've got Trump in, a position of power, and Boris Johnson, another, who, we've got world leaders who are on record as making very sort of homophobic, biphobic, transphobic statements. And suddenly those years of progress, I think the past couple of years have felt like how quickly that can be stripped away, and that it can feel like we're going backwards again. So I think that education being embedded is really, really important, and that feels like something that's positive and that will have a longer term impact.
Thank you. And I think, and that takes me quite well to my last question of considering the huge change that there's been since you were in school under Section 28, what would you want to go back and say to that 7-year-old Heather who realised that, I quite like Kylie and not Jason? What would you want to go back and say to her?
I think I just want to reassure her. Like, I was terrified of coming out for 11 years, and then when I did, no one was really bothered. They were like, yeah, that's cool. Like, they either already could guess or weren't really bothered or were like, positive about it. So all of those sort of fears that I had that I'd be disowned, no one would ever speak to me again, weren't true. And I held that with me for a lot of years. And so it'd be really nice to be able to go back and just tell everyone they'll be fine. And I know that isn't everyone's experience universally. So, there's no right or wrong time to come out. It's not something that anyone ever has to do. I think sometimes it can be difficult that we go, we have Pride and we have National Coming Out Day, and it's like everyone should be out and bold and proud of who they are. And yeah, that's brilliant. But actually, remembering that it's still not always safe for everyone to do that. So actually, that's what I would like to tell myself individually, because I know how that turned out and I know that it had a good ending. But it's not necessarily what I would be saying to, everyone just come out now and damn the consequences, because, the reality very much is for a lot of LGBT people that as much as we've moved on, that for some people that's still not a safe option for them. And for us to be aware of that. And, for those of us, I'm in a very lucky position that I am safe and comfortable and happy to be out, that I do this work and that I have this platform, and that I can sort of speak out and fly my flags and stuff. And the ability to do that when other people can't sort of makes it feel more important that I do that. Because there'll be people going, well, I wish I could, but there may be consequences. So for those of us where there aren't and we're able and willing to do that, I think it's a good thing.
Thank you to Heather for joining me on When Did You Know? Hope you enjoyed the episode, and please remember to keep sharing this podcast with everyone you know. Subscribe on whatever podcast provider you use, and please do leave a review on iTunes. It's the best way to get this podcast out there. And I'm sorry some of the episodes have been a little bit sporadic recently. My full-time job has taken over a little bit over the summer, but we should be back to weekly episodes from now on until the end of this season. And a thank you to Richard Abrahams for my theme music. Don't forget to follow me at WDYK Pod on Instagram and Twitter, or email me at wdykpod@gmail.com with questions, comments, or to volunteer yourself for an interview. Until next time.